Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new here, welcome to a very specific corner of the internet where we delve into the kind of history that makes other history channels seem, well, exciting. Tonight, we're not chasing dramatic battles or grand pronouncements. Instead, we're going to dim the lights, perhaps grab a warm beverage, and gently drift into the more overlooked corners of ancient mythology. We're going to explore figures and tales that, while technically important, never quite made it to the blockbuster movie treatment. So let's settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to have your eyelids feel just a little bit heavier as we contemplate the quiet, often uncelebrated lives of the gods. Tonight, our journey begins not with Zeus thundering on Olympus or Poseidon stirring the seas, but with a goddess who, bless her heart, was just there. We're talking about Hestia. Yes, that Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, architecture, and the right ordering of domesticity, which, if we're being honest, sounds less like a divine portfolio and more like a particularly meticulous homeowners association checklist. She was one of the 12 Olympian gods, which is a big deal, of course. Well, it was a big deal, for a while. You see, Hestia was one of the elder Olympians, a direct offspring of Rhea and Kronos. This put her in the same league as Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, and Demeter. She was, in fact, the firstborn of Rhea's children, meaning she was also the first one swallowed by Kronos, and then, naturally, the last one regurgitated. So she had that going for her. A sort of inverse birth order, one might say. First in, last out. A rather peculiar way to enter the world, or re-enter it as it were. Now, unlike her more boisterous siblings who were constantly squabbling, having affairs, or inventing new ways to turn mortals into trees, Hestia remained steadfast, literally. She was the personification of the hearth fire, and a hearth, as you know, tends to stay put. It doesn't go off gallivanting to conquer new lands or seduce unsuspecting nymphs. It just burns, steadily, dependably, which, if you're looking for high drama, is not exactly prime material. Hestia made an interesting choice early on. Both Poseidon and Apollo, in their youthful enthusiasm, or perhaps just out of a sense of divine obligation to propose to someone, apparently sought her hand in marriage. Imagine that scene. Two of the most powerful male gods vying for the goddess of, well, domestic harmony. One can only picture Hestia politely listening, perhaps tending to a small symbolic flame, before gently declining. She swore a solemn oath by the head of Zeus himself, an oath to remain a virgin forever, and Zeus, for his part, granted her wish. He also granted her the rather sensible privilege of always receiving the first offering at every public sacrifice, a small perk, perhaps, for a life dedicated to perpetual celibacy and hearth-keeping, but a perk nonetheless. It meant that even when the other gods were getting all the flashy sacrifices, Hestia always got her due, quietly, without fuss. This oath of eternal virginity placed her in the company of Athena and Artemis, the other two virgin goddesses. But even their virginity had a certain active quality to it. Athena was a warrior and a patron of crafts, bursting fully formed from Zeus's head, ready for action. Artemis was the wild huntress, roaming forests with her bow and arrows, a force of nature. Hestia just kept the home fires burning, figuratively and, well, literally. She didn't have temples bustling with priests and priestesses performing elaborate rituals of war or the hunt. Her worship was, fittingly, centered in the home. Every household hearth was, in essence, her altar, and in every city there was a public hearth, the Prytaneum, dedicated to her. It was a place where foreign ambassadors would be received, where the sacred fire of the community was maintained. A rather civic, bureaucratic kind of godhood, wouldn't you say? Her role was crucial in its own understated way. The hearth was the center of family life, the source of warmth, light, and cooking. It was where families gathered, where hospitality was offered. To violate the sanctity of the hearth was a truly terrible thing, which meant Hestia, in her quiet way, was a protector of the fundamental bonds of society. She wasn't out there slaying monsters or inciting wars. She was ensuring that when you came back from slaying monsters or fighting wars, there was a warm place to rest, a goddess of quiet reliability, a steady presence in a pantheon full of dramatic outbursts and cosmic shenanigans. There's a reason you don't see many epic poems or grand tragedies centered around Hestia. Her story simply doesn't lend itself to that kind of narrative. Can you imagine the Odyssey of Hestia, a tale of staying right where you are? It wouldn't exactly be a page-turner. She remained on Olympus, tending the sacred fire, a sort of divine homebody while everyone else was off having their dramatic adventures. And in a way, that was her power. The power of being constant, the power of being predictable, the power of simply being. Her image in art is equally unexciting. No dramatic lightning bolts, no tridents, no elaborate armor, just a veiled woman, often holding a branch or a kettle, sometimes accompanied by a donkey, which was apparently her sacred animal. A donkey, not a majestic eagle or fierce lion or even a graceful deer. A donkey. Because why not double down on the understated vibe she had going on? She was so utterly devoted to her tranquil domestic duties that she even gave up her seat on the Olympian council. Yes, you heard that right. She voluntarily relinquished her spot among the 12 most powerful deities. Why? To make room for Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, madness, and general disruption. Imagine the contrast. Hestia, the epitome of order and calm, stepping aside for the god of glorious chaos. It's almost as if she surveyed the scene, watched her siblings constantly bickering and causing trouble, and thought, you know what? I'm good. You all have fun with that. And so she retreated to the hearth of Olympus, forever tending its flames, a silent, steady presence while the drama unfolded around her. It's a sort of divine resignation, isn't it? I'm not saying I can't handle it, I'm just saying I'd rather not. And honestly, who can blame her? Imagine being stuck in a family full of powerful, narcissistic, and often petty individuals who are constantly trying to one-up each other, seduce mortals, or wage war. Hestia, with her gentle wisdom, seems to have figured out that true peace lay not in
wielding power, but in cultivating inner calm and a perpetually burning fire. She found her niche, her quiet strength, and she stuck to it. No major cults, no grand epics, just the comforting glow of every hearth in every home. A goddess for the introverts, perhaps. A goddess for those who prefer a quiet night in over a raucous party. It's tempting to view Hestia as merely boring compared to her flashier brethren, but perhaps, just perhaps, she understood something the others didn't. That true power isn't always about thunderbolts and seaquakes. Sometimes it's about the gentle, persistent warmth that keeps everything else going. The quiet foundation upon which all the wild adventures are ultimately built. And in a world filled with gods behaving badly, Hestia was the steady anchor, the reliable presence, the one you could always count on to just be there, tending the flame, quietly, eternally. And isn't there something profoundly comforting in that? A subtle, understated power that often goes unnoticed, but is nonetheless essential. The kind of power that lets you drift off to sleep knowing that somewhere a gentle flame is still burning. Let's float over to another rather overlooked mythological figure now. One who also had a distinct lack of dramatic flair, but a surprising amount of quiet influence, or at least quiet existence. We're talking about Persephone, but not the abduction story. Oh no, we're going much, much further back, to her early days before the pomegranates and the underworld negotiations, back to when she was simply Kore, the maiden, the perpetually young daughter of Demeter, minding her own business, picking flowers, because that's what young goddesses did, apparently, pick flowers, a lot of flowers. Before her rather dramatic career change, Persephone was, by all accounts, living a rather idyllic, if uneventful, life. She spent her days in flowery meadows, frolicking with nymphs like the Oceanids. Her mother, Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, grain, and general fertility, was incredibly doting, perhaps even a little overprotective. Demeter, you see, had already had her share of familial drama with Zeus, as most goddesses did, and she seemed to want a calmer, more serene existence for her daughter. So Kore was kept away from the more boisterous and dangerous aspects of Olympus, shielded from the machinations and amorous advances of the male gods, which, given the track record of those male gods, was probably a very sensible parenting decision. Imagine the scene: endless sun-drenched fields, blooming with every kind of flower imaginable, poppies, hyacinths, narcissus, and Kore, a radiant young maiden, carefully gathering them. Her companions, the nymphs, equally innocent and carefree. It was a picture of pastoral bliss, a little too blissful, perhaps, for the often grim realities of the Greek mythological universe. There was no intrigue, no conflict, no grand quests, just sunshine, flowers, and the gentle rustling of leaves. It was the kind of existence that, while lovely for a few hours, might eventually make one yearn for, well, something to happen. Anything, really, even a minor inconvenience. This was Kore's life, uncomplicated, pure, and dare we say it, a little bit boring. She wasn't forging weapons like Athena, or hunting game like Artemis, or even causing petty mischief like Hermes. She was simply existing in a state of perpetual springtime, a beautiful, innocent, and thoroughly undramatic maiden. Her purpose, at this stage, seemed to be primarily decorative,
and perhaps to provide her mother with a constant source of joy, which again is lovely for a goddess, but doesn't exactly make for gripping storytelling. Her greatest concern, one might imagine, was perhaps choosing the right shade of violet for her next garland, or perhaps which nymph had the prettiest laugh. These were the stakes of Kore's early life. Tiny, fragrant, and utterly inconsequential stakes. A gentle existence, far removed from the epic clashes of titans or the dramatic pronouncements of fate. It was a life untroubled by prophecy, unburdened by destiny. Just the gentle sway of wildflowers in a meadow and the soft murmur of girlish laughter, the kind of sound that might lull one into a peaceful slumber. Indeed, her very name, Kore, simply means the maiden. It's a descriptor, not a name with profound meaning or powerful connotations. It speaks to her role, or rather her lack of a defined, impactful role, before her fateful encounter. She was the innocent, the untouched, the symbol of burgeoning youth and the promise of spring, a blank canvas, if you will, awaiting the brushstrokes of destiny. And destiny, in her case, was about to make a very large, rather dark stroke. But we are not there yet. We are still in the meadows, still among the narcissus and the hyacinths, in the golden sunlight of a world blissfully unaware of the looming subterranean shadows. This pre-abduction Kore is a fascinating figure precisely because she is so unremarkable. She's the calm before the storm, the quiet before the earthquake. She represents a period of innocence that, in the tumultuous world of Greek myths, rarely lasted very long. Most heroes and gods were flung into conflict or drama from birth, or even before. But Kore was given a brief golden reprieve, a time of untroubled youth, a time for picking flowers and nothing much else. It was a time of simple beauty, of growing things, and of an almost profound absence of anything truly exciting. A beautiful blank page in the epic saga of the gods, filled only with the scent of blossoms and the gentle hum of bees. Chapter 2. The thrilling administrative duties of the Moirai. If you thought Hestia's life was a bit stagnant, let's drift over to the three fates, or the Moirai. Now, usually when people talk about the fates, they try to make them sound terrifying. They're the ones who decide when you die, after all. But if we actually look at their day-to-day existence, it wasn't so much a dark, brooding Gothic horror as it was a never-ending shift in a cosmic textile mill. There was Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. They were the daughters of Zeus and Themis, or perhaps of Night herself. The records are a bit fuzzy, mostly because nobody wanted to stick around long enough to ask for their birth certificates.
Clotho was the youngest, relatively speaking, and she was the spinner. Her entire divine purpose was to pull the thread of life from her spindle. Imagine doing that for eternity, just pulling thread. No podcasts, no music, just the rhythmic whir-click of the spindle. She didn't even get to decide what kind of thread it was. She just kept the production line moving. It's the ultimate entry-level job, except there's no promotion and the shift never ends. She was the ultimate entry-level job, except there's no promotion and the shift never ends. She was the technical one who began a life, but she did it with the enthusiasm of a DMV clerk processing a mountain of paperwork. Then we have Lachesis, the allotter. She was the middle child, and her job was arguably the most tedious of all. She measured the thread. While Clotho spun, Lachesis held the measuring rod. She decided exactly how long each life would be. You'd think this would involve some grand deliberation, but with billions of lives to process, it likely became a very mechanical process. 70 years for this one, 12 minutes for that one. Oh, look, a king. Let's give him 80. She wasn't being cruel, she was just staying on schedule. She was the human personification of a spreadsheet. If there was a glitch in the system, she probably just sighed and kept measuring. Finally, there was Atropos, the inflexible. She was the one everyone feared because she carried the abhorred shears and cut the thread. But honestly, if you were Atropos, you'd probably be pretty cranky too. Her sisters get to do the creative and organizational work, and she's just stuck with the cleanup. She's the cosmic janitor. Every time she snips, someone's journey ends. But to her, it was just another day at the office. Snip, next. Snip, next. There was no malice in it, just a very strict adherence to the measurements provided by Lachesis. She was the most efficient and likely the most bored member of the trio. They lived in a palace on Olympus, but they weren't exactly joining the other gods for nectar and ambrosia parties. They were too busy with the backlog. Mythology portrays them as hags or stern old women, but that's probably just because they were perpetually exhausted from the sheer volume of work. Imagine the repetitive strain injuries. They didn't have a social life, they didn't have hobbies, they just had the thread. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, was technically supposed to be subject to their decisions. Can you imagine Zeus trying to speak to the manager of destiny? And there's Lachesis, not even looking up from her measuring rod, just pointing to the no exceptions sign. There's a certain peacefulness in their monotony. The universe has a rhythm, and they are the ones keeping the beat. It's not a fast beat, it's a slow, steady, incredibly dull thrum. They represent the ultimate bureaucracy, a system so ancient and so rigid that even the gods can't find a loophole. While the heroes of Greece were out fighting hydras and getting into tragic love triangles, the Moirai were just sitting in their corner, spinning, measuring, and snipping. No drama, no fanfare, just the quiet rhythmic sounds of the cosmic loom. And then there's the matter of their diet. Some sources say they lived on the steam of sacrifices, which sounds deeply unsatisfying. Imagine being the reason everything happens, and your only reward is smelling someone else's barbecue from 3 miles away. It's no wonder they never smiled. They were the ultimate workaholics, dedicated to a task that offered no variety and no end. But in their world of endless thread, there was a strange kind of comfort. Everything was accounted for. Everything had a measurement. In the chaotic world of Greek myth, the Fates were the only ones who actually knew what time it was. Let's float down from the spinning room of the Fates and look at a god who was literally designed to be the most relaxing figure in history, Hypnos. Now, Hypnos is the god of sleep.
Unlike his brother Thanatos, Death, who was a bit of a buzzkill, Hypnos was actually quite popular. He lived in a cave in the land of the Cimmerians, a place where the sun never rose. Because, of course, the god of sleep would live in a place with permanent blackout curtains. His house was the ultimate nap destination. The river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flowed through the cave, creating a soft, bubbling sound that acted as a prehistoric white noise machine. There were no doors or gates, because doors might creak and wake him up.
Instead, the entrance was surrounded by poppies and other sleep-inducing herbs. It was essentially the world's first luxury spa, but without the overpriced cucumber water. Hypnos spent most of his time reclining on a soft couch. He didn't have many responsibilities, which is the dream, really. His main job was to fly over the earth and touch people with a branch dipped in the waters of the Lethe, or pour a little sleep-inducing juice from a horn. He did this with a very gentle, monotone efficiency. No one ever saw Hypnos coming. They just suddenly realized they were very interested in what their pillow had to say. He was often depicted as a young man with wings on his shoulders or his temples. The wings on the temples are a nice touch. It suggests that even his thoughts were ready to take a nap at any moment. He was married to Pasithea, one of the younger Graces, whom he was given as a bribe by Hera. Yes, even the god of sleep wasn't immune to the petty politics of Olympus. Hera wanted Hypnos to put Zeus to sleep, so she could interfere in the Trojan War without her husband noticing. Hypnos was understandably terrified. The last time he had tried to put Zeus to sleep, the king of the gods had woken up in a foul mood and tried to throw Hypnos into the sea. Hypnos only escaped by hiding in the arms of his mother, Nyx, Night, whom even Zeus was afraid to annoy. But Hera offered him a Grace for a wife, and Hypnos, apparently a romantic at heart, or just very tired of being single, agreed. He managed to lull the most powerful being in the universe into a snooze, which is perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of laziness. He had a whole brood of sons called the Oneiroi, who were responsible for different types of dreams. Morpheus was the most famous. He could take the form of humans in dreams. Phobator took the form of animals, and Phantassos took the form of inanimate objects like rocks or water. It was a family business. While the dad provided the sleep, the kids provided the entertainment. It was a very well-organized department of subconscious affairs. The beauty of Hypnos is that he never did anything in a hurry. His entire existence was a slow-motion glide through the shadows. He didn't have any grand temples or bloody sacrifices. People honored him by simply closing their eyes. He was the most relatable god, because at the end of a long day of dealing with the other, more high-maintenance gods, everyone just wanted to hang out with Hypnos. He was the god of the 5 more minutes snooze button. Imagine him floating through the dark Greek night, the silent flapping of his wings, the only sound. He's not looking for trouble. He's not looking for glory. He's just looking for people who are overworked, stressed out, or just plain tired. He gently tips his horn, a little mist falls, and suddenly the worries of the world just drift away. He is the ultimate antidote to the chaos of the Iliad. While Achilles is sulking in his tent and Hector is defending walls, Hypnos is just making sure everyone gets their recommended 8 hours. It's a very calm, very steady kind of power. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't require a parade, it just requires a comfortable spot to lie down. And as we think about Hypnos in his dark, quiet cave, listening to the gentle murmur of the river Lethe, it's hard not to feel a little bit envious. No emails, no notifications, just the soft scent of poppies and the eternal promise of a... Chapter 3. The relentless humidity of Achilles and the boredom of river governance. Since we've already established that the heights of Olympus and the depths of the dream world are surprisingly administrative, let's descend to the riverbanks to visit Achilles. Achilles was the patron god of the largest river in Greece, and as a result, he was technically the chief of all river gods. It sounds like a prestigious title, until you realize that being the chief of river gods mostly involves making sure water flows downhill and occasionally losing wrestling matches to more popular heroes. Achilles was the son of Oceanus and Tethys, which made him part of a family with roughly 3,000 brothers, all of whom were also rivers. Imagine family reunions where everyone is just a slightly different temperature of moving water. Because he was the eldest and the largest, he was given a bit more respect, but his life was largely a series of damp, repetitive cycles. He spent most of his time being a river, which is a full-time job that requires very little movement other than, well, flowing. He did have one notable moment of drama, though even that feels a bit weary in retrospect. He wanted to marry Deianira, a mortal princess, because apparently even a 3,000-year-old river god gets lonely. Unfortunately for him, Heracles, the ultimate jock of the Greek world, also wanted to marry her. Instead of having a civilized conversation, or perhaps a swimming race, they decided to wrestle. Now, Achilles had a trick up his sleeve, or rather in his currents. He was a shapeshifter. During the fight, he turned into a multicolored snake, thinking that might intimidate the man who famously strangled 2 serpents in his crib. It didn't. When that failed, he turned into a bull, because why not double down on the aggression? Heracles, being Heracles, simply grabbed him by the horns and ripped one of them off. This is where the story gets peak Greek myth. Instead of Achilles seeking revenge, he just kind of accepted it. The broken horn was taken by the naiads and turned into the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. So Achilles literally lost a piece of his head so that people could have a nice centerpiece for their dining tables. He retreated back into his river, probably nursing a headache, and went back to his primary hobby, being wet. He didn't plot a grand comeback, he didn't start a war, he just continued to flow toward the Ionian Sea, day after day, century after century. Being a river god meant dealing with the constant nagging complaints of the local nymphs. Let's float to the naiads, the freshwater nymphs who inhabited the springs, brooks, and fountains. While the world thinks of nymphs as ethereal beauties dancing in the moonlight, the reality of a naiad's life was mostly about water quality control. If someone threw a dead sheep in your spring, you had to deal with it. If the summer was too dry, you spent your days feeling slightly dehydrated and very cranky. The naiads were tied to their specific body of water. If the spring dried up, the nymph died. Talk about high-stakes property management. They didn't travel, they didn't go on vacations, they just sat by their respective puddles, making sure the moss grew at an acceptable rate. It was a life of profound stillness. Occasionally, a hero might stop by to ask for directions or a prophecy, but mostly it was just frogs, thousands of frogs, all day, every day.
There was a certain hierarchy to their boredom. The nymphs of grand, cascading waterfalls had a bit of excitement, but imagine being the naiad of a small, stagnant marsh on the outskirts of Boeotia. Your daily schedule involved watching the reeds grow and perhaps counting the dragonflies if things got really wild. There was no room for ambition in the life of a marsh nymph. You couldn't work your way up to a better lake. You were the marsh, and the marsh you. It was a relationship built on mutual dampness and a shared lack of social prospects. They were known for their hospitality, mostly because they were so desperate for conversation that even a lost goat looked like a primary source of entertainment. They would offer cool water and perhaps some watercress to anyone passing by, hoping for a bit of gossip from the next valley over. Did you hear about Zeus turning into a swan again? Yes, Doris, we heard it from the last 3 travelers. It's been 300 years. Get some new material. The most exciting thing that happened to a group of naiads, the Anagrides, was that they were believed to cure skin diseases. People would come to their cave, pray, and then bathe in the river. For the nymphs, this meant their quiet home was constantly being visited by people with very unappealing rashes. It wasn't the divine, glamorous life the poets wrote about. It was essentially running a free clinic in a damp cave with no ventilation. And yet, there's something oddly peaceful about this existence. The naiads and Achilles represented the parts of nature that don't need to be spectacular to be important. They were the background noise of the ancient world, the sound of trickling water, the smell of damp earth, the slow growth of lilies. They lived in a world where time was measured in erosion rather than hours. It was a long, slow, watery monologue of existence, punctuated only by the occasional broken horn or a particularly interesting dragonfly. As we leave the riverbanks, we can almost feel the humidity clinging to the air, the heavy, sleepy scent of the marshes lulling us into the same state of tranquil indifference that Achilles felt after his wrestling match. No more fighting, no more shape-shifting,
just the steady, rhythmic flow of the water, heading toward a sea that never gets any fuller, under a sun that never moves any faster. Chapter 4. The endless creaking of Tithonus and the hazards of incomplete paperwork. If you ever feel like your day is dragging on, just take a moment to consider the plight of Tithonus. Tithonus was a prince of Troy, and by all accounts he was quite the looker, at least in the beginning. He was so handsome, in fact, that he caught the eye of Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Now, being noticed by a goddess is usually the start of a very fast-paced tragedy, but in Tithonus's case, it turned into the longest, slowest administrative error in history. Eos was a goddess who lived for the early shift. Every morning she climbed into her chariot to announce the coming of the sun, which meant she had a lot of energy at 4 a.m. She fell head over heels for Tithonus and decided she wanted to keep him forever. Being a goddess of significant influence, she went straight to Zeus and asked for him to grant Tithonus immortality. Zeus, probably half asleep or just wanting to get back to his own business, nodded and said, "Sure, whatever." But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Eos forgot to ask for eternal youth. It's the ultimate check-the-fine-print moment of the ancient world. Of course, she didn't realize this right away. For a few decades, things were great. They lived in a palace at the edge of the world, watching the sun rise every single morning. But eventually, the laws of biology started to exert their pressure on Tithonus's mortal frame. He started to age, and he kept aging, and because he couldn't die, he just never stopped. The description of Tithonus's decline is one of the most quietly depressing things in mythology. He didn't just get a few gray hairs, he became a living relic of the concept of old. His skin became like parchment, his voice thinned out into a high-pitched, reedy squeak, and his bones became as light as dry twigs. Eos, who remained as fresh and dewy as, well, the dawn, didn't really know what to do with him. She pampered him for a while, giving him ambrosia and fine clothes, but as he became more and more frail, he eventually couldn't even move his limbs. Imagine lying in a golden bed in a palace of the gods, unable to move, unable to die, and listening to the goddess of the dawn chirping about her morning commute for the 10,000th year in a row. It wasn't a life of adventure, it was a life of extreme, prolonged stagnation. Eventually, Eos got tired of the constant creaking and the endless, mindless babbling Tithonus was doing in his aged state, so she did what any responsible deity would do. She put him in a room and shut the door. He stayed there for centuries, a tiny, shriveled figure tucked away in a corner of a celestial palace. He wasn't suffering in the way Prometheus was. There were no eagles involved, but he was experiencing a level of boredom that is practically transcendental. He was just a voice, a dry, repetitive sound echoing in a room no one visited. Finally, out of a sense of pity, or perhaps just because she wanted some peace and quiet, Eos turned him into a cicada, or a grasshopper, depending on which bored poet you ask. It's actually a very fitting end. He went from being a handsome prince to a tiny, dry insect that spends its entire life chirping a single repetitive note. When you hear the cicadas in the heat of a summer afternoon, that rhythmic, hypnotic buzz, buzz, buzz sound, that's Tithonus. He's still there, still aging, still talking to himself, and perfectly, utterly ignored by everyone. It's the ultimate sleepy story because nothing happens. He just persists. He's the personification of a Sunday afternoon that never ends. No climax, no resolution, just the steady, dry sound of an insect in the grass. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest gift isn't living forever, but knowing when to exit the stage and have a nice long nap. Let's float away from the dry grass and into the heavy, dusty atmosphere of the world's first library archives. Let's talk about the Cumane Sibyl. Much like Tithonus, she had a run-in with a god that resulted in a very long, very quiet retirement. Apollo, the god of music and light, was quite taken with her and offered her anything she wanted in exchange for her affection. The Sibyl, being a bit suspicious of gods bearing gifts, picked up a handful of sand and asked to live for as many years as there were grains of sand in her hand. Apollo granted the wish instantly. But, in what apparently was a recurring theme among the Olympians, she also forgot to ask for eternal youth, because why not double down on the same mistake? She lived for centuries. She saw empires rise and fall, she saw fashions change, and she saw the sand in her hand slowly disappear. By the time the Romans came around to consult her, she had withered away so much that she was reportedly kept in a glass jar or a small cage suspended from the ceiling of her cave. When children would ask her what she wanted, she would simply whisper in a voice like dry leaves, "I want to die."
But she couldn't. She just had to sit there, being ancient and dusty, and occasionally writing prophecies on leaves that the wind would blow away before anyone could read them. It was the world's most frustrating filing system. She wasn't a dramatic figure of doom. She was just a very, very old woman who had seen everything and was frankly over it. Her life was a long monologue of "I told you so," delivered to a room full of empty shadows. There's a pattern here, isn't there? The Greeks seem to find the idea of forever to be inherently exhausting. Whether it's Tithonus chirping in the weeds or the Sibyl shrinking in her jar, the message is clear. The most divine thing you can do is eventually just stop. The world keeps turning, the sun keeps rising, and the gods keep meddling. But for the rest of us, there is the quiet, blissful promise of the end of the shift. As we think of the Sibyl in her quiet cave, the only sound, the faint rustle of her prophetic leaves, we can feel that same sense of heavy, ancient time pressing down on us. It's a comfortable weight. It's the weight of a thick blanket on a cold night. It's the feeling of a story that has gone on so long that the plot doesn't even matter anymore. All that matters is the rhythm of the breathing and the softness of the dark. Chapter 5. The static existence of Atlas and the world's longest core workout. If you've ever found yourself stuck in a long queue or waiting for a slow computer to restart, you might find a kindred spirit in Atlas. Atlas was a Titan, and after the Titans lost their 10-year-long war against the Olympian gods, a conflict that was probably quite loud and exhausting, he was given a very specific, very stationary punishment. Zeus decided that instead of throwing Atlas into the dark pit of Tartarus with his brothers, he would give him a job that required zero travel and an incredible amount of standing still. He was tasked with holding up the celestial sphere. Now, common art often depicts him holding the earth on his shoulders, but the Greeks originally had him holding up the sky to keep it from falling onto the land. It's a subtle distinction, but either way, it's a lot of weight. Imagine being the human pillar of the universe. He didn't get breaks. He didn't get to stretch. He just stood there at the western edge of the world near the Garden of the Hesperides, performing the ultimate isometric exercise for all eternity. His life was the definition of monotonous. While the other gods were busy inventing theater, wine, and complicated love lives, Atlas was just supporting. He was the ultimate background character. He watched the sun go down every evening and the moon come up every night. He saw the stars rotate above him, which was probably the only entertainment he had, counting the constellations over and over again until he knew every single glimmer by heart. Because why not double down on the boredom? The only time his routine was ever interrupted was when Heracles showed up. Heracles was on his 11th labor, trying to get some golden apples, and Atlas, who was understandably desperate for a moment to roll his shoulders, agreed, but only if Heracles held the sky for a bit. For a brief, glorious moment, Atlas was free. He walked to the garden, got the apples, and came back feeling like a new man. He actually had the audacity to suggest that he keep walking and deliver the apples himself, leaving Heracles with the sky indefinitely. It was a good plan, honestly, a solid attempt at a career change. But Heracles, being a bit of a trickster, pretended to agree and just asked Atlas to take the weight back for 1 second so he could put a pad on his shoulders.
Atlas, who was apparently as gullible as he was strong, took the sky back, and Heracles simply walked away. Atlas went right back to his original position. No more apples, no more walking, just the familiar heavy pressure of the heavens. He didn't even get angry. He just went back to being a mountain. In fact, according to some later stories, Atlas eventually became so tired and so still that he actually turned into the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. His hair became forests, his shoulders became cliffs, and his head disappeared into the clouds. There's something deeply peaceful about that transition, from a struggling titan to a silent, stony range of peaks. He stopped being a person who had to endure and became a part of the landscape that just is. Let's float over from the stony peaks of Atlas to another figure of immense, quiet endurance, Leto. Leto was a goddess of motherhood and modesty, but she is mostly remembered for the incredibly long, incredibly slow walk she had to take while she was pregnant. Because Hera was jealous, as she usually was, she decreed that no firm land could receive Leto to give birth, and she also sent a giant serpent named Python to chase her. Now, chase might be a strong word. It was more of a persistent, sluggish pursuit. Leto wandered from place to place, looking for somewhere to sit down, while everyone turned her away out of fear of Hera. It was a journey of endless no's. She visited islands, mountains, and cities, always moving, always heavy, always tired. It was the ancient equivalent of trying to find a bathroom in a city where every cafe has a customers-only sign. Eventually, she found Delos. At the time, Delos was a floating island, which meant it technically wasn't firm land or connected to the earth. It was just drifting around the Aegean Sea like a piece of cosmic driftwood. The island agreed to host her, and Leto finally got to stop walking. But even then, the labor lasted 9 days because Hera kept the goddess of childbirth, Eileithyia, distracted with a very large necklace. For 9 days, Leto just leaned against a palm tree on a tiny, barren rock in the middle of the ocean. There was no drama, no shouting, just the slow, rhythmic passage of time and the sound of the waves hitting the shore. When Artemis and Apollo were finally born, the island became fixed in place, and flowers bloomed everywhere. But for Leto, the victory wasn't the glory of her children. It was finally being allowed to be still. Her life after that was remarkably quiet. She didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't want to rule. She just wanted to be a mother and enjoy the silence she had earned through her long, weary wanderings. As we think about Atlas and Leto, one standing still until he became a mountain, the other wandering until she became a part of a quiet island, we can feel a sense of profound calm. Their stories aren't about winning or losing. They're about the endurance of the soul and the eventual transition into peace. The sky is held up, the children are born, and the world continues its slow, sleepy rotation. Chapter 6. The Beige Eternity of the Asphodel Meadows and the Art of Doing Nothing. If the idea of a busy afterlife stresses you out, then the Asphodel Meadows are exactly where you want to be. While the poets spent a lot of time talking about the fiery pits of Tartarus or the VIP lounge of Elysium, the vast majority of people in Greek mythology ended up in the Asphodel Meadows. It was the ultimate middle-of-the-road destination. If you weren't a legendary hero and you weren't a mustache-twirling villain, you went here. It was the cosmic equivalent of a very large, very quiet airport waiting room, where the flight is perpetually delayed and there's no Wi-Fi. The meadows were filled with asphodel flowers, which are actually real plants. They have pale, ghostly blossoms and grayish leaves, and they tend to grow in poor, sandy soil. It's a very fitting aesthetic for a place where nothing ever happens. The shades here, known as shades, didn't have much of their personality left.
They drifted around in a sort of grayish mist, chirping like bats, and occasionally remembering that they once had a favorite pair of sandals. But for the most part, they were just there. There were no chores in Asphodel, no bills to pay, no wars to fight, and no laundry to fold. But there was also no food, no drink, and no sun. It was just a flat, endless field of muted colors and muffled sounds. The shades spent their time wandering aimlessly, occasionally bumping into someone they knew in life and exchanging a very vague, very slow greeting. "Oh, hello, Pericles. Still dead?" "Yes, still dead. You?" "Indeed." And then they would drift off again. Because why not double down on the lack of conversation? The landscape was punctuated by the river Lethe, which we've mentioned before. In the meadows, the shades would occasionally take a sip from the river to forget their mortal lives. This was considered a mercy. After a few hundred years of standing in a gray field, you really don't want to remember that you once lived in a house with a view and ate fresh bread. It's much easier to just lean into the beige. The Lethe provided a constant, gentle erasure, making the afterlife a series of, wait, what was I saying? Moments. There's a certain tranquility in this kind of boredom. It's a place where the ego finally goes to sleep. There's no competition, no striving, and no stress. It's just a long, slow, monotone existence. The shades didn't even have enough energy to be sad. They were just peaceful in a very dusty, very pale sort of way. It's the ultimate sleep-inducing thought, an eternity where the most exciting thing that happens is a slightly stronger breeze moving through the gray flowers. Let's drift from the silent fields of the dead to a god who presided over the most boring part of the living world, Terminus. Terminus was the god of boundary markers. Yes, specifically the stones that marked where one person's farm ended and another's began. He didn't have a human form, usually. He was just a stone. A very important stone, mind you, but a stone nonetheless. His worship involved people coming out to the edge of their fields, putting some garlands on a rock, and maybe pouring a little oil on it. Terminus didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even have arms to catch the garlands. His entire divine power was based on the concept of staying exactly where he was placed. When they were building the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, they supposedly found a shrine to Terminus. The other gods were moved to make room for the new temple, but Terminus refused to budge. The priests took this as a sign that the boundaries of Rome would never be moved. Imagine being the god of no, not a loud, angry no, but a quiet, stubborn, immovable no. Terminus is the patron saint of the person who stays in their lane and minds their own business. He doesn't have epic poems written about him because, frankly, there's only so much you can say about a rock that sits in a ditch. But in his stillness, there's a profound sense of security. He is the god of the fence post, the god of the property line, the god of knowing exactly where you stand. There is something deeply lulling about the idea of Terminus. In a world that is always changing, always moving, and always demanding our attention, Terminus just sits there. He doesn't care about the news. He doesn't care about the weather. He just holds his ground. He is the ultimate anchor. As we think about the gray, silent shades in the asphodel meadows and the mossy, unmoving stones of Terminus, we can feel our own boundaries softening. The world outside becomes less important, and the quiet, steady rhythm of being takes over. The shades wander, the stones sit, and the asphodels sway in a wind we can't feel. It's a very slow, very gray, very peaceful way to exist. No one is in a hurry. No one is shouting. Everything is just settled. Chapter 7. The shared optometry of the Graii and the world's slowest game of catch. If you think sharing a bathroom with a roommate is difficult, let's consider the living situation of the Graii. Dino, Ennio, and Pemfredo were three sisters who were born old. They didn't have a childhood, they didn't have a rebellious teenage phase, they just popped into existence with gray hair and a shared sense of profound exhaustion. They lived in a cave at the foot of Mount Atlas, a place where the sun was more of a suggestion than a reality, wrapped in a perpetual damp fog that made everything look like a faded charcoal drawing. But their living arrangements weren't the most peculiar part of their story. No, the real administrative headache was their equipment. Between the three of them, they had exactly one eye and one tooth. Imagine the logistics of a typical Tuesday. Enyo, are you done looking at that rock? It's my turn to see if the fog has moved 3 inches to the left. They spent their entire lives passing a single eyeball back and forth, like a very slow, very wet, hot potato. Their existence was a long, monotone dialogue of coordination. It wasn't a life of action, it was a life of sensory management. Because they lived in such a remote, misty place, there actually wasn't much to see anyway. Most of the time, the eye was just taking in different shades of gray. One can imagine them sitting on their stone benches, the dampness of the cave seeping into their ancient bones, just waiting for a turn to perceive the gloom. It's the ultimate sleep-inducing scenario. 3 people sitting in the dark, passing a marble back and forth, and occasionally sharing a single tooth to nibble on a piece of dried seaweed.
They were the sisters of the Gorgons, but they lacked the flair for drama that Medusa possessed. They didn't turn people to stone, they just made them feel a bit awkward. The only time they ever entered the historical record was when Perseus showed up. Perseus, in his quest to be the most annoying hero in Greece, decided to steal their eye while they were in the middle of a handoff. It was a low blow, really. He held the eye hostage until they gave him directions to the nymphs. The Gray didn't fight back. How could they? They were literally blind the moment he grabbed it. They just sat there, waving their hands in the air, politely requesting their optical property back. Once the transaction was over, they went right back to their cave. They didn't plot a revenge arc. They didn't call for a divine intervention. They just settled back into their routine of sitting, waiting, and passing. Because why not double down on a system that clearly isn't working? There is something strangely hypnotic about their life. The rhythm of the handoff, the silence of the cave, the muffled sound of the ocean in the distance. They represent a state of being that is almost entirely internal. They didn't need the world. They just needed each other and their one shared window into the gray. They were the personification of making do. As we think of them huddled together in the mist, their voices a soft, raspy murmur, it's hard not to feel a sense of heavy, rhythmic calm. Let's float away from the cave and into the sky to visit a figure who spent his entire life being a very dedicated, very slow celestial GPS, Phosphorus. Phosphorus was the personification of the morning star, the planet Venus when it appears before sunrise. He was the son of Eos, the goddess of the dawn we met earlier, and like his mother, he had a very strict, very early work schedule. His job was to ride a white horse across the sky just ahead of his mother's chariot. He was the herald of the light. But unlike the sun, who had a big, fiery chariot and a lot of ego, Phosphorus was just a point of light. He didn't have any dialogue. He didn't have any myths where he got into trouble. He just appeared every single morning at the exact same time in the exact same part of the sky. He had a brother, Hesperus, who was the evening star. For a long time, the Greeks didn't even realize they were the same planet. They thought they were 2 different brothers who were incredibly good at social distancing. Hesperus would show up at sunset, Phosphorus would show up at dawn, and they would never, ever meet. It was a life of celestial shifts, no holidays, no sick days, just the eternal, silent glide through the fading stars. Phosphorus is the patron god of the quiet transition. He's the one who is there when the world is still blue and cold, before the birds start their morning racket. He represents the moment when sleep is at its deepest and most profound. There's no heat in his light, just a cool, steady glow. He doesn't demand that you wake up. He just lets you know that the night is ending in the most polite way possible. Imagine the silence of the upper atmosphere, the cold, thin air, the soft hoofbeats of a celestial horse that makes no sound. Phosphorus isn't in a hurry. He doesn't need to be. The dawn is coming behind him regardless. He's just there to be the first glimmer of the day. A long, silent, golden monologue of a life written in the stars and erased by the sun every 24 hours. As we think about the gray passing their eye in the dark and Phosphorus riding his horse through the twilight, we can feel the world slowing down. The movements are small, the sounds are muffled, the light is dim. It's a world where nothing is urgent and everything is part of a very old, very tired routine. The eye is past, the star rises, and the fog remains exactly where it was yesterday. Chapter 8. The sedentary splendor of the Hamadryads and the thrill of growing bark. If you think the Naiads had it rough by being tied to a puddle, let's consider the Hamadryads. These were a very specific class of nymphs who weren't just the protectors of trees, they were actually part of the trees. While a standard dryad could arguably wander off for a bit of a stroll or a divine party, a Hamadryad lived and died with her specific trunk. This meant their entire life was spent in a single, vertical position. If the tree was an oak that lived for 500 years, the Hamadryad spent 500 years standing exactly in that spot, because why not double down on the commitment to one's local zip code? Their daily routine was, as you might imagine, remarkably consistent. They didn't have to worry about what to wear or where to go for dinner. Their schedule was dictated entirely by the seasons and the slow, rhythmic movement of sap. In the spring, there was the mild excitement of budding leaves. In the summer, the heavy, sleepy labor of photosynthesis. In the autumn, the gentle, rustling process of letting go. And in the winter, the ultimate nap. A deep, wooden hibernation that lasted months. Imagine the perspective of a being that perceives time through the growth of rings. To a Hamadryad, a passing human was like a blurry, frantic insect. They watched empires rise and fall in the time it took them to grow a single sturdy limb. They didn't engage in the bickering of Olympus. They didn't care about who was stealing whose lightning bolt. Their concerns were much more fundamental. Is there enough rain? Is that woodpecker being a bit too aggressive today? Should I grow this leaf slightly more to the left to catch that afternoon sun? There is something strangely hypnotic about their life. The profound hum of the earth, the silence of the cave, the muffled sound of the ocean in the distance. They represent a state of being that is almost entirely internal. They didn't need the world, they just needed each other and their one shared window into the gray. They were the personification of making do. As we think of them, huddled together in the mist, their voices a soft, raspy murmur, it's hard not to feel a sense of heavy, rhythmic calm. Let's float away from the cave and into the sky to visit a figure who spent his entire life being a very dedicated, very slow celestial GPS, Phosphorus. Phosphorus was the personification of the morning star, the planet Venus when it appears before sunrise. He was the son of Eos, the goddess of the dawn we met earlier, and like his mother, he had a very strict, very early work schedule. His job was to ride a white horse across the sky, just ahead of his mother's chariot. He was the herald of the light. But unlike the sun, who had a big, fiery chariot and a lot of ego, Phosphorus was just a point of light. He didn't have any dialogue. He didn't have any myths where he got into trouble. He just appeared every single morning at the exact same time in the exact same part of the sky. He had a brother, Hesperus, who was the evening star. For a long time, the Greeks didn't even realize they were the same planet. They thought they were two different brothers who were incredibly good at social distancing. Hesperus would show up at sunset, Phosphorus would show up at dawn, and they would never, ever meet. It was a life of celestial shifts, no holidays, no sick days, just the eternal, silent glide through the fading stars. Phosphorus is the patron god of the quiet transition. He's the one who is there when the world is still blue and cold, before the birds start their morning racket. He represents the moment when sleep is at its deepest and most profound. There's no heat in his light, just a cool, steady glow. He doesn't demand that you wake up. He just lets you know that the night is ending in the most polite way possible.
Imagine the silence of the upper atmosphere, the cold, thin air, the soft hoofbeats of a celestial horse that makes no sound. Phosphorus isn't in a hurry. He doesn't need to be. The dawn is coming behind him regardless. He's just there to be the first glimmer of the day. A long, silent, golden monologue of a life, written in the stars and erased by the sun every 24 hours. As we think about the gray passing their eye in the dark and Phosphorus riding his horse through the twilight, we can feel the world slowing down. The movements are small, the sounds are muffled, the light is dim. It's a world where nothing is urgent and everything is part of a very old, very tired routine. The eye is past, the star rises, and the fog remains exactly where it was yesterday. Chapter 8. The sedentary splendor of the Hamadryads and the thrill of growing bark. If you think the Naiads had it rough by being tied to a puddle, let's consider the Hamadryads. These were a very specific class of nymphs who weren't just the protectors of trees, they were actually part of the trees. While a standard dryad could arguably wander off for a bit of a stroll or a divine party, a Hamadryad lived and died with her specific trunk. This meant their entire life was spent in a single, vertical position. If the tree was an oak that lived for 500 years, the Hamadryad spent 500 years standing exactly in that spot, because why not double down on the commitment to one's local zip code? Their daily routine was, as you might imagine, remarkably consistent. They didn't have to worry about what to wear or where to go for dinner. Their schedule was dictated entirely by the seasons and the slow, rhythmic movement of sap. In the spring, there was the mild excitement of budding leaves. In the summer, the heavy, sleepy labor of photosynthesis. In the autumn, the gentle, rustling process of letting go. And in the winter, the ultimate nap. A deep, wooden hibernation that lasted months. Imagine the perspective of a being that perceives time through the growth of rings. To a Hamadryad, a passing human was like a blurry, frantic insect. They watched empires rise and fall in the time it took them to grow a single sturdy limb. They didn't engage in...
Most of the time, however, the Hamadryads were simply left alone to grow. They represented the parts of the world that don't need to do anything to be significant. They just are. There is something incredibly lulling about the thought of a life spent as an oak or a poplar. The feeling of deep roots in cool, damp soil. The sensation of wind moving through your hair, which just happens to be several thousand leaves. The slow, steady pulse of life that moves not in seconds, but in decades. Let's drift from the deep woods to the silent, dusty edges of the horizon to visit a god who presided over the most redundant job in the universe, Aeolus's lesser-known assistants, the Anemoe Thueli. While the main four winds, north, south, east, and west, got all the fame and the fancy names, the Thueli were the storm winds, the chaotic, disorganized gusts that lived in a dark, hollow mountain. Their existence was the definition of standby. They were kept locked inside the mountain of Lipara, or perhaps a cave on the island of Aeolia, behind massive bronze doors. Their entire life consisted of waiting for Aeolus to get a memo from a higher-ranking god. Most of the time, they just sat in the dark, swirling around each other in a bored, aimless fashion. They weren't allowed to go out and play. They were the break-in-case-of-emergency gods. When the doors finally opened, they didn't have a mission. They just rushed out in a confused, frantic burst of energy, knocked over a few ships, scattered some clouds, and then were inevitably whistled back into their dark hole. It was a life of extreme boredom, punctuated by brief moments of mindless, uncoordinated activity. They didn't have personalities. They didn't have goals. They were just the atmospheric equivalent of a very restless waiting room. Imagine the sound inside that mountain, a constant, low, muffled whistling, the feeling of air moving against air in a space that never changes. It's the ultimate white noise machine. To the Thueli, the world outside was just a myth, a place they occasionally visited for 5 minutes before being put back in the box. They were the personification of pent-up energy that has nowhere to go. As we think of the hamadryads rooted in their silent groves and the winds trapped in their hollow mountain, we can feel a sense of heavy, stagnant peace. The tree doesn't move, the wind doesn't escape. The world is held in a state of perpetual, quiet tension. There is no need to hurry because there is nowhere to go. There is only the slow growth of bark and the faint, distant whistle of air in the dark. It's a comfortable, rhythmic stillness that makes the eyes feel heavy and the mind feel light. Chapter 9. The domestic duty of the Penates and the thrill of flower preservation. If the high-stakes drama of Olympus feels a bit too loud for your current mood, let's retreat into the dim, quiet corners of a Roman pantry. Here we find the Penates. These weren't the kind of gods who demanded golden temples or human sacrifices. They were the little gods, the spirits of the household stores. Their entire divine purpose was to ensure that the family's food supply didn't go bad. It was a career in celestial inventory management, and they took it very seriously, or at least as seriously as a spirit of the larder can. The Penates were usually worshipped alongside the Lyres, the protectors of the house itself, but the Penates had a more specific focus, the Enus, or the inner pantry. While the heroes of legend were busy fighting chimeras, the Penates were focused on the much more relatable task of making sure the grain stayed dry and the olive oil didn't turn rancid. It was a life of profound, dusty stillness. They lived in the darkest part of the house, tucked away behind jars of salted pork and sacks of lentils. Their worship was as quiet as their existence. At every meal, the family would throw a small piece of food into the hearth for them. It was a polite, rhythmic gesture of gratitude for the fact that the house hadn't run out of salt yet. The Penates didn't have voices that shook the earth. If they spoke at all, it was likely the sound of a lid settling on a jar, or the soft rustle of a mouse that they were politely discouraging from entering the grain bin, because why not double down on the domestic tranquility? They were the ultimate homebodies. To a Penate, a trip to the front door was a major excursion. They were deeply tied to the family they served. If the family moved, the Penates moved with them, packed carefully into a crate with the other valuables. They were the personification of settled. There is something deeply lulling about the idea of gods who find fulfillment in the orderly arrangement of honey jars and the slow, predictable depletion of the winter wheat. It's the safety of having enough, the quiet satisfaction of a full shelf in a dark room. Let's drift from the dry, quiet pantry to the heavy, sun-drenched silence of the fields to visit a god who was essentially a personified nap. Priapus, now, is often remembered for being, well, a bit much. But if we look past the obvious physical exaggerations, his actual job was incredibly tedious. He was a god of gardens and fertility, but specifically he was a protector against thieves and birds. In practice, this meant that statues of Priapus were placed in orchards and vegetable patches to act as divine scarecrows. Imagine being a god whose primary interaction with the world is having a crow land on your head. He spent his entire day standing in the heat of the Mediterranean sun, painted a bright, gaudy red, and staring at a row of cabbages. He didn't have adventures. He didn't have a retinue of followers. He just had a wooden club and a very long, very boring watch over the fruit trees. It was a life of extreme boredom, punctuated by brief moments of mindless, uncoordinated activity. They didn't have personalities. They didn't have goals. They were just the atmospheric equivalent of a very restless waiting room. Imagine the sound inside that mountain, a constant, low, muffled whistling, the feeling of air moving against air in a space that never changes. It's the ultimate white noise machine. To the Thueli, the world outside was just a myth, a place they occasionally visited for 5 minutes before being put back in the box. They were the personification of pent-up energy that has nowhere to go. As we think of the hamadryads rooted in their silent groves and the winds trapped in their hollow mountain, we can feel a sense of heavy, stagnant peace. The tree doesn't move, the wind doesn't escape. The world is held in a state of perpetual quiet tension. There is no need to hurry because there is nowhere to go. There is only the slow growth of bark and the faint, distant whistle of air in the dark. It's a comfortable, rhythmic stillness that makes the eyes feel heavy and the mind feel light. Chapter 9. The domestic duty of the Penates and the thrill of flower preservation. If the high-stakes drama of Olympus feels a bit too loud for your current mood, let's retreat into the dim, quiet corners of a Roman pantry. Here we find the Penates. These weren't the kind of gods who demanded golden temples or human sacrifices. They were the little gods, the spirits of the household stores. Their entire divine purpose was to ensure that the family's food supply didn't go bad. It was a career in celestial inventory management, and they took it very seriously, or at least as seriously as a spirit of the larder can. The Penates were usually worshipped alongside the Lares, the protectors of the house itself, but the Penates had a more specific focus, the Enus, or the inner pantry. While the heroes of legend were busy fighting chimeras, the Penates were focused on the much more relatable task of making sure the grain stayed dry and the olive oil didn't turn rancid. It was a life of profound, dusty stillness. They lived in the darkest part of the house, tucked away behind jars of salted pork and sacks of lentils. Their worship was as quiet as their existence. At every meal, the family would throw a small piece of food into the hearth for them. It was a polite, rhythmic gesture of gratitude for the fact that the house hadn't run out of salt yet. The Penates didn't have voices that shook the earth. If they spoke at all, it was likely the sound of a lid settling on a jar, or the soft rustle of a mouse that they were politely discouraging from entering the grain bin, because why not double down on the domestic tranquility? They were the ultimate homebodies. To a Penate, a trip to the front door was a major excursion. They were deeply tied to the family they served. If the family moved, the Penates moved with them, packed carefully into a crate with the other valuables. They were the personification of settled. There is something deeply lulling about the idea of gods who find fulfillment in the orderly arrangement of honey jars and the slow, predictable depletion of the winter wheat. It's the safety of having enough, the quiet satisfaction of a full shelf in a dark room. Let's drift from the dry, quiet pantry to the heavy, sun-drenched silence of the fields to visit a god who was essentially a personified nap. Priapus, now, is often remembered for being, well, a bit much. But if we look past the obvious physical exaggerations, his actual job was incredibly tedious. He was a god of gardens and fertility, but specifically he was a protector against thieves and birds. In practice, this meant that statues of Priapus were placed in orchards and
states of perpetual waiting, governed by the slow cycles of the harvest and the even slower rhythm of the household. The flower stays dry, the peaches stay on the branch, the gods remain in their places, unmoving and content. It's a world where the greatest event of the day is a change in the light or the settling of dust on a jar. A world that invites you to close your eyes and join in the long, ancient tradition of doing absolutely nothing at all. Chapter 10. The submerged metallurgy of the Telchines and the dampness of forgotten talent. If you ever feel like your hard work is being ignored by your boss, spare a thought for the Telchines. They were a tribe of sea dwellers, often described as having the bodies of humans, but the flippers of seals, or the heads of dogs, which honestly sounds like a lot of genetic confusion for one species. They lived on the island of Rhodes, and they were the original master craftsmen. Long before Hephaestus was setting up his flashy forge on Olympus, the Telchines were down in the damp, dark caves of the seabed, making things out of metal. They were the ones who forged the trident for Poseidon. Think about that.
The most iconic weapon of the sea was made by a group of dog-headed fish people who were so good at their jobs they didn't even need a marketing department. But because they were also associated with evil magic, mostly because they were introverts who lived in wet caves and probably smelled like old kelp, the other gods eventually got a bit twitchy about them. Their daily existence was a long, rhythmic monologue of hammers hitting anvils underwater. If you've ever tried to do anything underwater, you know it takes about 10 times longer than it does on land. Everything is slow. Every movement is resisted by the weight of the sea. The Telchines lived in a world of muffled clangs and rising bubbles. It was a career in high-end manufacturing, but with the added bonus of perpetual humidity. They weren't out there seeking glory or starting cults. They were just focused on the cooling properties of the brine. Eventually, Zeus and Poseidon decided that the Telchines were getting a bit too weird, so they flooded their island and drove them into the deepest parts of the ocean. The Telchines didn't fight a grand war. They didn't build a giant mechanical robot to defend themselves. They just moved. They retreated further into the dark, cold trenches where the pressure is high and the light is non-existent. They went from being world-class smiths to being forgotten myths, living in a silent, watery void where the only sound is the occasional glow of a bioluminescent fish drifting past their anvil. The Telchines are still down there, theoretically, hammering away at things no one will ever see, in a workshop that never needs to be swept. It's the ultimate remote work setup, taken to its logical, damp conclusion. Let's drift up from the crushing depths to the dusty, sun-bleached roads of ancient Italy to visit a goddess whose only job was to make sure you didn't trip, Volutina. Volutina was one of the many minor Roman agricultural deities. Specifically, she was the goddess of the envelopes of the grain, the husks. Yes, while Ceres was responsible for the whole concept of agriculture, Volutina was specifically in charge of the part of the plant that people usually throw away. Her life was a masterpiece of specialized boredom. She didn't have a temple, she didn't have a choir. She just existed during that brief period when the grain was forming its protective coating. She was the goddess of the wrapper. Imagine the stakes of her divine existence. Is the husk slightly too thin? I should probably look into that. Is the husk a bit too scratchy? Better luck next season. She was a deity of the mundane, a spirit of the technicality. She represented the Roman obsession with breaking every single action down into its smallest, most boring components. There was a god for the first word a child spoke, a god for the hinges of the door, and Volutina, the goddess of the leaf sheath. She is the patron saint of the fine print. Her existence was a quiet, golden blur of wheat fields waving in the wind. No drama, no conflict, just the slow, silent process of a plant getting its clothes on. As we think about the Telchines in their silent, pressurized caves and Volutina in her dry, whispering fields, we can feel a sense of profound, specialized peace. One is the master of the deep, cold dark. The other is the master of the warm, papery light. Both are content to do one thing and one thing only for all eternity. They don't need the world to notice them. They don't need a fan club. They are just parts of a machine that has been running for so long that it has become its own kind of silence. The hammer falls in the deep. The husk tightens in the sun. The world continues its slow, rhythmic breathing. It's a world where the smallest detail is enough for a lifetime, and where the greatest ambition is simply to remain undisturbed. A world that invites you to let go of the big picture and just drift into the tiny, beautiful, boring details of being.
Somnus was rarely seen without a wreath of poppies around his head, and he often carried a horn from which he poured out sleep-inducing dews. He didn't walk, he drifted. He didn't speak, he sighed. If you were to encounter him, you wouldn't find a terrifying deity of the night, but rather a very soft, very pale young man who looked like he'd been hit with a particularly heavy Sunday afternoon. His power was absolute, precisely because it was so passive. You can't argue with a yawn, and you certainly can't fight a god who makes your eyelids feel like they've been replaced with lead weights. The only time Somnus ever really got busy was when Juno, the Roman Hera, needed a favor. Usually this involved putting her husband, Jupiter, to sleep, so she could commit some minor act of divine domestic sabotage. Somnus would always protest at first, his voice a low, raspy whisper, complaining about the light and the noise of the upper world. But eventually he would sigh, wrap himself in his cloak of shadows, and glide up to the heavens. He would touch Jupiter's brow with his poppy-soaked branch, wait for the king of the gods to start snoring, and then immediately head back to his cave before the first bird could chirp. There is something profoundly comforting about the existence of Somnus. He represents the part of the universe that is always turned off. In his cave, there are no expectations, no deadlines, and no drama. There is only the cool, dry air, the scent of poppies, and the eternal, muffled sound of the river. He is the personification of the off switch on a grand cosmic scale. As we think of him lying on his ebony bed, his breathing so slow it's almost undetectable, we can feel that same sense of heavy, velvet darkness pressing in on us. Let's drift from the cave of Somnus to the dusty, sun-baked roads of the Roman countryside to visit a goddess who was essentially the patron saint of the quiet life, Vacuna. Vacuna was an ancient Sabine goddess who was later adopted by the Romans. Her name comes from the same root as vacation and vacant. She was the goddess of leisure, of being at rest, and of the absence of work. She was the deity you turned to when the harvest was over and there was absolutely nothing left to do but sit on a stone wall and watch the grass grow. Her worship didn't involve grand processions. Instead, people honored her by simply doing nothing. A festival for Vacuna was basically a day of organized lounging. The farmers would stop their plowing, the weavers would put down their shuttles, and everyone would just be. Horace, the Roman poet, famously mentioned her shrine near his villa, noting that he felt most at peace when he was in her jurisdiction. Vacuna was often depicted as a veiled woman sitting down, because of course she was sitting. Standing requires effort, and Vacuna was all about the conservation of energy. She was the goddess of the gap in the schedule, the quiet hour in the afternoon when the world seems to hold its breath. She didn't have a complicated mythology because, well, having a complicated life would be against everything she stood for. Her story is a blank page, which is exactly how she liked it. As we think about Somnus in his dark, silent cave and Vacuna sitting on her sun-warmed stone, we can feel the two halves of the perfect rest. One is the deep, forgotten slumber of the night. The other is the conscious, peaceful stillness of the day. Neither one asks anything of us. Both are happy to let the world turn without their interference. The ebony bed remains soft. The stone wall remains warm. The gods remain still, their lives a long, quiet monologue of not now. It's a world that invites us to put down our burdens, to close our eyes, and to realize that the most divine thing we can do right now is absolutely nothing at all. Chapter 12. The beige bureaucracy of the Manes and the art of being vaguely remembered. If the idea of an afterlife filled with singing choirs or eternal battles sounds a bit too loud for your taste, let's settle into the Roman concept of the Manes. These were the good spirits, the collective souls of the deceased ancestors who occupied a space that was less heaven and more cosmic storage unit. The Manes didn't spend their eternity playing harps or being tortured. They spent it in a state of profound, dignified, and incredibly dusty quietude. They were the personification of the word ancestral, existing in a realm that felt like the back of a very old library, one where nobody has checked out a book in 300 years. The Romans were very polite to their Manes.
They believed that as long as the family continued to acknowledge them with small offerings of wine, honey, and flowers, the Manes would remain content in their beige eternity. They didn't have specific faces or dramatic backstories after a few generations. They just became a collective they, a group of spirits sitting in the shadows of the underworld, perhaps occasionally commenting on the quality of the latest batch of funerary wine. Is this a Pinot? A bit acidic, don't you think? Yes, but at least they didn't forget the violets this year. Their daily routine, if you can call it that, was entirely dependent on the calendar. During the festival of Parentalia in February, the Manes were allowed to drift back to the world of the living to see how the descendants were doing. But they didn't come back to cause trouble or reveal hidden treasures. They just hung out. They sat at the edges of the family hearth, invisible and silent, watching the grandkids eat their porridge. It was a very low-impact haunting. They were the ultimate quiet guests, who never overstayed their welcome because they were frankly just as happy to head back to the quiet dark where it was a bit more peaceful. There's something remarkably soothing about the existence of the Manes. They represent the part of the universe that is always turned off. In their cave, there are no expectations, no deadlines, and no drama. There is only the cool, dry air, the scent of poppies, and the eternal, muffled sound of the river. He is the personification of the off switch on a grand cosmic scale. As we think of him lying on his ebony bed, his breathing so slow it's almost undetectable, we can feel that same sense of heavy, velvet darkness pressing in on us. Let's drift from the cave of Somnus to the dusty, sun-baked roads of the Roman countryside to visit a goddess who was essentially the patron saint of the quiet life, Vacuna. Vacuna was an ancient Sabine goddess who was later adopted by the Romans. Her name comes from the same root as vacation and vacant. She was the goddess of leisure, of being at rest, and of the absence of work. She was the deity you turned to when the harvest was over and there was absolutely nothing left to do but sit on a stone wall and watch the grass grow. Her worship didn't involve grand processions. Instead, people honored her by simply doing nothing. A festival for Vacuna was basically a day of organized lounging. The farmers would stop their plowing, the weavers would put down their shuttles, and everyone would just be. Horace, the Roman poet, famously mentioned her shrine near his villa, noting that he felt most at peace when he was in her jurisdiction. Vacuna was often depicted as a veiled woman sitting down, because of course she was sitting. Standing requires effort, and Vacuna was all about the conservation of energy. She was the goddess of the gap in the schedule, the quiet hour in the afternoon, when the world seems to hold its breath. She didn't have a complicated mythology because, well, having a complicated life would be against everything she stood for. Her story is a blank page, which is exactly how she liked it. As we think about Somnus in his dark, silent cave and Vacuna sitting on her sun-warmed stone, we can feel the two halves of the perfect rest. One is the deep, forgotten slumber of the night. The other is the conscious, peaceful stillness of the day. Neither one asks anything of us. Both are happy to let the world turn without their interference. The ebony bed remains soft. The stone wall remains warm. The gods remain still, their lives a long, quiet monologue of not now. It's a world that invites us to put down our burdens, to close our eyes, and to realize that the most divine thing we can do right now is absolutely nothing at all. Chapter 12. The Beige Bureaucracy of the Manes and the Art of Being Vaguely Remembered. If the idea of an afterlife filled with singing choirs or eternal battles sounds a bit too loud for your taste, let's settle into the Roman concept of the Manes. These were the good spirits, the collective souls of the deceased ancestors who occupied a space that was less heaven and more cosmic storage unit. The Manes didn't spend their eternity playing harps or being tortured. They spent it in a state of profound, dignified, and incredibly dusty quietude. They were the personification of the word ancestral, existing in a realm that felt like the back of a very old library, one where nobody has checked out a book in 300 years. The Romans were very polite to their manes. They believed that as long as the family continued to acknowledge them with small offerings of wine, honey, and flowers, the manes would remain content in their beige eternity. They didn't have specific faces or dramatic backstories after a few generations. They just became a collective they, a group of spirits sitting in the shadows of the underworld, perhaps occasionally commenting on the quality of the latest batch of funerary wine. Is this a Pinot? A bit acidic, don't you think? Yes, but at least they didn't forget the violets this year. Their daily routine,
His image was found on countless Roman coins, usually holding a pair of scales and a cornucopia. He wasn't a god of grand gestures, he was a god of the decimal point. His life was a masterpiece of balance. He spent his days ensuring that things were just okay. Not too much, not too little. Perfectly mediocre. In a world of divine extremes, Equitas was the steady, boring pulse of the status quo. He was the god of the fair deal, the patron saint of the receipt. Imagine the conversation in the temple of Equitas. It wouldn't be filled with passionate prayers or dramatic oaths. It would be a series of very calm, very technical discussions about the calibration of bronze weights. It was a divine office job. There was no room for passion in the world of Equitas. Passion ruins the balance of the scales. There was only the quiet, rhythmic clink of metal against metal and the soft scratching of a stylus on a wax tablet. Equitas is the patron god of the peaceful compromise. He is the one who steps in when the bickering gets too loud and says, "Let's just split it down the middle and go home." He represents the comfort of the predictable. When you deal with Equitas, you know exactly what you're going to get. No surprises, no tricks, just the steady, monotone certainty of the math. As we think of the Manes sitting in their quiet floral shadows and Equitas watching his perfectly balanced scales, we can feel our own internal scales settling. The highs and lows of the day start to level out. The need to be special or to be noticed fades away, replaced by the quiet, beige satisfaction of just being fairly all right. The world is balanced, the ancestors are satisfied, the grain is weighed. Everything is in its proper place, tucked away in the drawers of history. The light is dim, the air is still, and the only sound is the faint rhythmic ticking of a cosmic clock that has no hands. It's a world that invites you to be average, to be quiet, and to finally, mercifully, be still.
Our own space becoming more secure. The door is shut, the step is taken, the outside world is a distant, muffled memory. The hinges are oiled and silent. The stone is cool and firm. The gods of the threshold are on duty, which means you don't have to be. Everything is contained. Everything is safe. The air in the hallway is still. The dust motes are dancing in a single shaft of light, and the world has narrowed down to a single, peaceful room. It's a world that invites you to kick off your sandals, to lean back against the wall, and to realize that the most important place to be is exactly where you are. Chapter 14. The fragrant patience of Stercutus and the slow drying of the fields. If the lofty concepts of door hinges and thresholds felt a bit too elevated, let's get down to the actual earth, specifically the very fertile, very stationary earth overseen by Stercutus. Stercutus was the Roman god of manuring. Yes, while other civilizations had gods of the sun or the moon, the Romans, being the practical, agriculture-obsessed people they were, decided they needed a divine supervisor for the compost pile. And honestly, it's a job that perfectly captures the essence of a sleepy monologue, because nothing in the universe moves slower than the decomposition of organic matter. Stercutus was often identified with Saturn, the god of time and agriculture, which makes sense when you think about it.
Manuring is just a very slow way of turning the past into the future. His life wasn't about the thrill of the harvest or the excitement of the first sprout. It was about the long, steaming, incredibly dull middle period. He spent his divine eternity presiding over the pits where things were broken down. It was a career in celestial recycling, and it required a level of patience that would make a mountain seem impulsive. Imagine the daily routine of a god of fertilizer. He didn't have a choir of angels, he had a chorus of flies. His temple was the back corner of every farm in Latium, a place where the air was thick, heavy, and smelled vaguely of damp hay and potential. Stercutus didn't rush the process. He understood that you can't negotiate with chemistry. He just sat there, metaphorically speaking, watching the piles settle, watching the heat rise, and watching the world turn itself back into soil. It was a life of profound, quiet rot, because why not double down on the most unglamorous part of the cycle? There is something strangely lulling about the work of Stercutus. It represents the ultimate, not my problem yet phase of growth. It's the deep, dark, nutrient-rich silence before anything starts to happen. When you think of Stercutus, you think of a warm, damp heap in the corner of a field under a hazy afternoon sun. No one is shouting. No one is working. The energy is all internal, a slow chemical hum that takes months to complete its sentence. He is the god of the simmer, the patron saint of the slow burn. Let's drift from the compost pile to the dry, golden light of the hayfields to visit a goddess who was essentially the personification of a heat wave, Messia. Messia was one of the many minor deities involved in the grain cycle, specifically tasked with the protection of the mown hay while it was drying. If the grain had already been cut, Messia's job was to make sure it just sat there, under the sun, perfectly still. Her life was a monologue of golden light and the smell of dried grass. She didn't have to worry about weeds or pests. Her only enemy was moisture. So she spent her days ensuring that the air remained hot and the breeze remained light. It was a life of extreme, sun-drenched stagnation. She watched the grass turn from green to gold, a process so slow you could sleep for 3 days and not miss a single shade of the transition. Messia is the goddess of the aftermath. The hard work of the reaping is over, and now there is only the waiting. She represents that specific kind of summer exhaustion where the air is so heavy you can almost lean against it. In her world, the only thing moving is the occasional grasshopper or the shimmering heat waves rising off the stubble. She is the spirit of the long afternoon, the one who ensures that nothing happens until everything is perfectly bone dry. There is something profoundly closure in the domain of Messia. The task is finished, the tools are put away, and the results are just soaking up the silence. As we think about Stercutus in his damp, dark corner and Messia in her bright, dry field, we can feel the two ends of the agricultural breath. One is the heavy exhale of the old year, the other is the quiet, sun-baked pause before the storage begins. Neither one requires your attention. Both are happy to proceed at a pace that is almost geological. The piles are settling. The hay is drying. The gods are watching the dust motes drift in the heavy, warm air. It's a world that invites you to lie down in the tall grass, to feel the heat of the earth beneath you, and to realize that the most productive thing you can do right now is to simply evaporate. The cycle is moving, the earth is turning, and the silence is absolute. Chapter 15. The meticulous silence of the storehouse and the geometry of the cobweb. If the heat of the hayfields was a bit too intense, let's step back into the cool, shadowed interior of the Roman storehouse to visit the spirits of the deep shelf. While we've already met the Penates, there were even more specialized entities whose entire existence was dedicated to the things that happen when a room is left entirely alone. These were the gods of the settling, the silent guardians of the forgotten corner. Their job was to oversee the very slow, very gray process of a space becoming truly, deeply still. Chief among them was a conceptual deity who governed the accumulation of dust. While the Romans didn't have a flashy name for a god of dust motes, they certainly behaved as if one existed, treating the undisturbed layers of a granary with a certain level of superstitious respect. To disturb a shelf that had been still for a decade was to invite a certain kind of atmospheric chaos. The spirits of this realm lived in millimeters. Their entire life's work was the gradual rhythmic descent of tiny particles landing one by one on the shoulder of an old amphora. It was a career in celestial sedimentation, and it moved at a pace that makes a glacier look like a sprinter.
Imagine the perspective of a being that finds the growth of a cobweb to be a high-stakes dramatic event. To these spirits, the spider was not a pest, but a master architect of the quiet. They watched as the first silk strand was anchored to a beam, followed by the second, and then the third, until a complex, dusty lattice had been woven across the ceiling. They didn't move to clean it, they moved to ensure it remained undisturbed. They were the patron saints of the "do not touch" policy. Their existence was a long, gray monologue of silence, written in the delicate geometry of a corner that hasn't seen a broom since the reign of Augustus. There is something profoundly hypnotic about the idea of a god of the undisturbed. It represents the ultimate victory over the frantic energy of the living. In the storehouse, time doesn't tick, it just accumulates. Every layer of dust is a year. Every cobweb is a century. When you think of these spirits, you think of the smell of dry wood and ancient stone. You think of a place where the air is so still that a single falling leaf would sound like a thunderclap. They are the guardians of the long nap, the ones who ensure that the world outside stays exactly where it belongs, outside. Let's float from the dusty rafters to the heavy, liquid silence of the olive press to visit a goddess whose life was a study in viscosity, Olia. Olia was the spirit of the settling oil. After the olives had been crushed and the liquid had been collected, it had to sit in large ceramic jars for weeks so that the sediment could sink to the bottom, leaving the clear golden oil on top. Olia's job was to supervise this descent. She was the goddess of the sink. Her life was a masterpiece of patient observation. She didn't have a temple, she had a vat. She spent her days watching a slightly murky liquid become slightly less murky. It was a process of refinement through sheer, stubborn inactivity. Olia understood that the best things in life take time to separate. She didn't stir, she didn't shake, and she certainly didn't rush. She just existed in the heavy, fragrant dark, feeling the microscopic particles of fruit slowly, slowly dropping through the golden amber of the oil. Olia is the goddess of the clarity. She represents the peace that comes after the pressure has been applied. The crushing of the olives was loud and violent, but the domain of Olia is silent and smooth. In her world, the greatest achievement is to be perfectly transparent. She is the patron saint of the unhurried, the one who knows that if you just wait long enough, everything will eventually find its proper level. She is the patron saint of the person who's happy to let the world settle itself.
As we think about the spirits of the dust and the goddess of the oil, we can feel a sense of profound rhythmic settling within ourselves. The dust is landing, the oil is clearing, the world is separating into its essential parts. There is no need to interfere. There is no need to move. Everything is following a plan that was written in the silence of the very first storehouse. The rafters are gray and soft. The jars are heavy and gold. The gods are watching the tiny, invisible movements of a world at rest. It's a world that invites you to become a part of the architecture, to let the layers of the day settle around you, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can be right now is perfectly, utterly still. The door is locked, the air is cool, and the quiet is absolute. Chapter 16. The elongated shadows of crepusculum and the cooling of the stones. If the stillness of the storehouse felt like a final destination, let's step outside into the soft purple air of the Roman evening. Here we find the minor spirits of the twilight, the ones who didn't quite make it into the major myths, but were essential for the transition from the frantic heat of the day to the heavy silence of the night. Chief among these was the concept of crepusculum, the personification of the dusk. While other gods were busy being the sun or the moon, crepusculum was the god of the in-between. His entire existence was a 20-minute window of fading light. His life was a masterpiece of the gradual. He didn't arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic entrance. He simply manifested as the slow, inevitable stretching of shadows. Imagine the patience required to be a god whose only job is to make the shadows of the cypress trees grow 3 inches longer every minute. It's a career in celestial dimming. He spent his divine eternity watching the gold of the afternoon turn into the gray of the evening. It was a long, silent monologue of color theory, where the stakes were simply whether a stone looked orange or blue. Because why not double down on the subtlety? Crepusculum was the patron saint of the long exhale. He represented the moment when the Roman farmer would lean his shovel against the wall and simply look at the horizon. In his world, the air began to lose its weight, and the sharp edges of the landscape started to blur. He was the goddess of the smudge, the one who ensured that the transition to sleep was as seamless as possible. He didn't demand worship, he just demanded that you notice how quiet things were becoming. There is something profoundly lulling about the work of the twilight spirits. It's the ultimate winding down phase of the universe. When you think of crepusculum, you think of the sound of a distant goat bell and the first cool breeze hitting a sun-warmed wall. No one is in a hurry anymore. The light isn't bright enough to work by, but it isn't dark enough to need a lamp. It's the period of perfect, unproductive peace. He is the goddess of the pause, the one who holds the world in a soft, lilac-colored stasis before handing it over to the night. Let's drift from the purple air to the ground beneath our feet to visit the spirits of the cooling stones. The Romans believed that every part of the landscape had its own genius, and in the evening, the spirits of the rocks and the roads had a very specific, very slow task: losing their heat. After a long day of soaking up the Mediterranean sun, the stones would sit in the shadows and slowly radiate their warmth back into the air. This was the domain of the Sidero, the spirits of the chill. Their life was a study in thermal dissipation. They didn't have voices, they had a temperature. They spent their evenings in a state of quiet mineral relief. They didn't move, they didn't speak, and they certainly didn't have drama. They just cooled. It was a process of refinement through sheer, stubborn inactivity. Olia understood that the best things in life take time to separate. She didn't stir, she didn't shake, and she certainly didn't rush. She just existed in the heavy, fragrant dark, feeling the microscopic particles of fruit
slowly dropping through the golden amber of the oil.
Center of letting go of the intensity of the day. To a spirit of the cooling stone, the greatest event of the hour was the arrival of a single dewdrop, or the sensation of the air becoming 1 degree colder. The Sidera represent the physical sensation of rest. They are the spirit of the cool pillow, the one who knows that the best way to prepare for sleep is to let go of the heat. In their world, the goal is to reach a state of perfect, stony indifference. They are the patron saints of the settled, the ones who find contentment in the fact that they aren't going anywhere. They are the silent foundation of the night. As we think about Crepusculum stretching his shadows and the Sidera cooling their stones, we can feel a sense of profound thermal peace. The light is fading. The heat is leaving. The world is becoming gray, soft, and cool. There is no need to act. There is no need to think. You are simply a part of the landscape, waiting for the first star to appear in a sky that is no longer blue. The shadows have reached the wall. The stones are cold to the touch. The spirits of the evening are finishing their shift, and the world is ready to be tucked in. It's a world that invites you to breathe slowly, to let the colors of your mind fade into the purple mist, and to realize that the most important thing you can do right now is to simply disappear into the dark. Atmosphere, specifically those who govern the arrival of the dew. In the Roman world, this was the quiet domain of Ros, the personification of the morning dew, though she did most of her best work while everyone was firmly unconscious. Ros was a goddess of the incremental. While her more famous relatives were busy tossing lightning or stirring up hurricanes, Ros was focused on the microscopic. Her entire divine existence was a monologue of moisture. She spent her nights overseeing the cooling of the air until it reached that precise mathematical point where water vapor decides to become a liquid. It was a career in celestial condensation. Imagine the patience required to watch a single blade of grass for 4 hours, waiting for that first tiny translucent bead to manifest. Because why not double down on the infinitesimal? Her daily routine was the definition of low impact. She didn't arrive with a splash, she arrived with a dampness. She was the goddess of the refresh, but in the most understated way possible. She didn't want to drown the world, she just wanted to make sure the dust was settled and the leaves were slightly less parched by sunrise. Her voice was not a sound, but the faint cold drip that occurs when a drop of water becomes too heavy for its leaf. It was a language of gravity and surface tension, a soft, wet lullaby that signaled the earth was taking its deepest breath. There is something profoundly lulling about the world of Ros. It represents the ultimate victory of the small over the large. In her realm, the greatest achievement is to be barely there. When you think of her, you think of the smell of wet earth and the sight of a silver mist clinging to the hollows of the hills. She is the spirit of the unseen work, the one who knows that the world is mended in the dark, one molecule at a time. She is the guardian of the soak, the one who understands that the most important growth happens when no one is looking. Let's float from the damp grass up toward the velvet ceiling of the night to visit the spirits of the celestial mechanics, specifically the deities of the star turn. While the astronomers of the world were busy trying to map the heavens, the Romans acknowledged a group of minor, unnamed spirits whose only job was to ensure that the stars moved at a constant, boring, and predictable pace. This was the domain of the Sidereum, the spirits of the slow rotation. Their life was a study in circularity. They didn't have stories, they had orbits. They spent their eternity in a state of quiet, angular momentum. They didn't move fast, they didn't change direction, and they certainly didn't have tantrums. They just turned. It was a career in cosmic clockwork.
To a spirit of the sidereal, the greatest event of the night was the passage of a constellation across a specific meridian, or the slow, rhythmic alignment of a planet with a distant, unblinking star. The sidereal represent the mathematical certainty of the night. They are the spirits of the steady pulse, the ones who know that the best way to handle the infinite is to break it down into a series of very small, very repetitive movements. In their world, the goal is to be perfectly, utterly predictable. They are the patron saints of the routine, the ones who find fulfillment in the fact that they are exactly where they were supposed to be 10,000 years ago. They are the silent, shining witnesses to the fact that everything is under control. As we think about Ross distilling her dew and the sidereal turning their stars, we can feel a sense of profound, mechanical peace. The air is moist and cool. The sky is vast and steady. The world is moving, but it's moving so slowly and so predictably that it feels like it's standing still. There is no need to hurry. There is no need to catch up. You are simply a passenger on a very large, very quiet ship that is sailing through a sea of indigo ink. The grass is silver and wet. The stars are distant and cold. The spirits of the midnight hour are moving in their eternal, boring circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, heavy grace. It's a world that invites you to stop trying to understand the big picture and to start feeling the rhythm of the small one, to let your breath synchronize with the turning of the spheres, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to simply exist in the dark. corners. She is the guardian of the buffer, the one who understands that the soul needs a layer of padding between sleep and the demands of the day. Let's drift from the damp gray fields toward the edge of the forest to visit the spirits of the first light, specifically the deities of the pale glare. While Eos was the famous goddess of the dawn, the Romans acknowledged a group of unnamed minor spirits whose only job was to provide that first, cold, drain-water gray light that precedes the actual sunrise. This was the domain of the crepusculum matutinum, the spirits of the bleak beginning. Their life was a study in desaturation. They didn't have colors, they had shades of pewter. They spent their brief daily existence in a state of quiet, monochromatic preparation. They didn't have the heat of the sun or the mystery of the night. They just had the undark. It was a career in celestial dimming in reverse. To a spirit of the pale glare, the greatest event of the morning was the moment a white pebble became visible against the brown dirt, or the slow, rhythmic transition of a black forest into a dark green one. The crepusculum matutinum represent the slow, grinding gears of the world's restart. They are the spirits of the cold start, the ones who know that the transition from nothing to something should be as gradual as possible. In their world, the goal is to be perfectly, utterly unremarkable. They are the patron saints of the early riser's regret, the ones who find fulfillment in the fact that they are providing just enough light for you to see your own breath, but not enough to actually make you want to get out of bed. They are the silent, gray witnesses to the fact that the day is coming, whether you like it or not. As we think about Nebula spreading her fog and the spirits of the pale glare draining the shadows of their depth, we can feel a sense of profound, dampened peace. The air is heavy and cool. The world is a smudge of charcoal and ash. There is no need to hurry. There is no need to plan. You are simply a shape in a world of shapes, waiting for the light to become strong enough to cast a shadow. The grass is hidden. The trees are ghosts. The spirits of the gray hour are moving in their slow, muffled circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, indecisive grace. It's a world that invites you to pull the blankets higher, to close your eyes against the coming light, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to stay exactly where the fog is thickest. Chapter 20. The Heavy Limbs of Pondiculatio and the Divine Effort of Awakening. If the gray fog was the world's way of hitting the snooze button, then the transition into the first movements of life falls under the jurisdiction of a very specific, very lethargic group of deities. In the Roman tradition, even the physical act of waking up wasn't left to chance. There were minor spirits for every involuntary twitch, and chief among them was the personification of the morning stretch, Pondiculatio. While other gods were busy with grand acts of creation, Pondiculatio was focused entirely on the slow, creaky realignment of the human frame. Her entire divine existence was a monologue of the yawn. She didn't have a temple with marble columns. Her sanctuary was the warm space beneath a wool blanket at approximately 6 a.m. Her job was to oversee that specific, shaky tension when you reach your arms toward the headboard and your toes toward the foot of the bed. It was a career in celestial ergonomics. Imagine the patience required to be a goddess whose primary function is the sound of a popping joint or the long, involuntary ah that accompanies a deep breath, because why not double down on the biology of the groggy? Her daily routine was the definition of glacial. She didn't want you to jump out of bed. She wanted you to stay in a state of semi-liquid transition for as long as possible. She was the goddess of the 5 more minutes. She didn't speak in commands. She spoke in heavy sighs. Her voice was the rustle of sheets being kicked aside and the soft, muffled thud of a pillow hitting the floor. It was a language of tendons and ligaments, a slow, rhythmic lullaby that suggested the day could wait, at least until the sun was higher than the neighbor's roof. There is something profoundly lulling about the world of pandiculatio. It represents the ultimate respect for the body's own rhythm. In her realm, the greatest achievement is to move as little as possible while still technically being awake. When you think of her, you think of the smell of stale air and the sight of dust motes dancing in that first cruel shaft of light hitting the carpet. She is the spirit of the uncoordinated, the one who knows that the brain takes much longer to start than the heart. She is the guardian of the threshold of consciousness, the one who understands that the soul needs to be gently coaxed back into the skin after a night of wandering with the manes.
As we think about Pandiculatia overseeing our stretches and the Frigidula waiting in their cool basins, we can feel a sense of profound, heavy-eyed peace. The blankets are still warm, but the air is becoming crisp. The world is a series of slow, deliberate movements. There is no need to run, there is no need to speak. You are simply a being in the process of becoming, waiting for the coffee or the Roman equivalent, a very watered-down wine, to make life seem like a reasonable idea. The sheets are tangled, the water is cold. The spirits of the awakening hour are moving in their slow, creaky circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, reluctant grace. It's a world that invites you to move one finger at a time, to listen to the house settling around you, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to simply exist in the quiet before the day begins. Chapter 21. The Viscous Meditation of Pulse and the Theology of the Wooden Spoon. If the first splash of water was the alarm clock of the Roman world, then the breakfast table was its recovery room. Here we encounter the minor deities of the morning meal, specifically those who presided over the pulse, or the thick grain porridge that fueled the empire. While Ceres looked after the wheat in the field, there were much smaller, more patient spirits who lived in the pot. These were the guardians of the simmer, the spirits of the thickening grain. Their entire divine existence was a monologue of the bubble and the stir. The life of a porridge spirit was a study in viscosity. They didn't have wings, and they didn't have lightning bolts. They had a wooden spoon and a very low flame. Their job was to ensure that the water and the grain became one in a process so slow it was practically geological. Imagine the patience required to be a god whose primary function is the plop of a single air bubble rising through a dense layer of spelt. It was a career in culinary sedimentation. Because why not double down on the most repetitive kitchen task imaginable? The daily routine of these spirits was the definition of unhurried. They didn't want the pot to boil over, and they didn't want the bottom to burn. They just wanted a state of perpetual, heavy rotation. They were the gods of the clockwise motion. Their voice was the rhythmic scraping of wood against ceramic, and the soft, wet sound of the porridge settling into a bowl. It was a language of starch and heat, a slow, thick lullaby that suggested the day could only truly begin once everyone had consumed something that felt exactly like a warm hug for the stomach. There is something profoundly lulling about the world of the pulse. It represents the safety of the predictable. In this realm, the greatest achievement is to have no lumps. When you think of these spirits, you think of the smell of toasted grain and the sight of steam rising in a vertical line through the still air of the atrium. They are the spirits of the consistency, the ones who know that the best foundation for a life is a meal that takes 20 minutes of constant stirring. They are the guardians of the patience, the ones who understand that the most important part of the morning is the time spent waiting for the food to be ready. Let's drift from the bubbling pot to the small, sticky jar sitting on the edge of the table to visit a goddess whose life was a study in slow-motion flow, Mellona. Mellona was the Roman goddess of bees and honey, but her true power was felt in the way honey moves on a cold morning. She was the goddess of the drip. Mellona's life was a masterpiece of surface tension. She spent her divine eternity watching honey fall from a spoon. If you've ever tried to pour honey in the winter, you know it's a process that invites you to contemplate the nature of time itself. Mellona was there for every agonizingly slow millimeter of the journey. She didn't want the honey to rush. She wanted it to coil and fold over itself in a golden, translucent braid. It was a career in celestial syrup management. To a spirit like Melona, the greatest event of the day was the moment a single drop finally detached itself and landed on a piece of bread with a silent, sticky impact. Melona represents the sweetness of the delay. She is the spirit of the lingering, the one who knows that the best things in life are the ones that refuse to be hurried. In her world, the goal is to be perfectly, utterly yellow and still. She is the patron saint of the slow drizzle, the one who finds fulfillment in the fact that she is making the world a little bit heavier and a little bit sweeter, one molecule at a time. She is the silent, golden witness to the fact that even the smallest addition to the day requires a certain amount of ceremony. As we think about the spirits stirring the porridge and Melona watching her honey, we can feel a sense of profound, carbohydrate-induced peace. The steam is rising. The honey is flowing, eventually. The world is a series of small domestic rituals. There is no need to check the news. There is no need to start the commute. You are simply a being in the process of being fed, waiting for the warmth to reach your toes. The pot is off the fire, the spoon is resting, the spirits of the breakfast hour are moving in their slow, sticky circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, well-fed grace. It's a world that invites you to move one finger at a time, to listen to the house settling around you, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to simply exist in the quiet before the day begins.
Leave a fabric one molecule at a time. It was a career in atmospheric extraction. They spent their eternity watching the weight of a tunic change as the moisture escaped into the air. Because why not double down on the slowest chore in the history of civilization? The daily routine of these spirits was the definition of stationary. They didn't want the wind to blow too hard, that leads to wrinkles, and they didn't want the clouds to move in. They just wanted a steady, unrelenting, and incredibly boring beam of sunlight. They were the gods of the static hang. Their voice was the soft flap-flap of linen in a light breeze, and the smell of hot wool and ozone. It was a language of fibers and ultraviolet rays, a slow, sun-baked lullaby that suggested the day could only truly proceed once everything was perfectly bone dry. There is something profoundly lulling about the world of the laundry. It represents the peace of the held. In this realm, the greatest achievement is a straight hem. When you think of these spirits, you think of a courtyard where the only thing moving is a single grasshopper on a stone wall. They are the spirits of the bleach, the ones who know that the sun can heal almost anything if you just give it enough time. They are the guardians of the unmoving, the ones who understand that there is a deep, quiet power in simply hanging there and letting the universe do the work for you. The spirits of the fold. Let's drift from the bright, hot courtyard to the cool, shaded interior of the linen chest to visit the spirits of the fold. These were the deities of the neat stack, the ones who governed the geometry of the closet. Their life was a masterpiece of the right angle. They didn't have adventures, they had creases. The sensation, the feeling of heavy, sun-warmed linen being pressed flat by a steady hand. The sound, the muffled thump of a folded tunic being placed on top of another. The goal, a perfect rectangular stability that suggests nothing will ever be messy again. The spirits of the fold represent the closure of the cycle. The dirt is gone, the water is gone, and now there is only the orderly arrangement of the future. They are the patron saints of the put away, the ones who find fulfillment in the fact that they're creating a sense of readiness for a day that hasn't happened yet. They are the silent, linen-scented witnesses to the fact that life is better when it's neatly stacked. As we think about the sun bleaching the tunics and the spirits pressing the folds, we can feel a sense of profound, orderly peace. The laundry is hanging, the sun is working, the world is a series of slow, predictable drying cycles. There's no need to rush to the forum. There's no need to start the business of the day.
You are simply a being in a clean shirt, waiting for the shadows to move another inch across the floor. The lines are full, the wind is low, the spirits of the courtyard are moving in their slow solar circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, starched grace. It's a world that invites you to lean against a warm pillar, to close your eyes against the glare, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to simply stay out of the way. Chapter 23. The Horizontal Empire of the Siesta and the Guard of the Shutter. If the drying laundry was a study in solar energy, the Roman afternoon was a study in its total avoidance. As the sun reached its zenith, the Roman world didn't double down on productivity, it collectively surrendered. This was the hour of the meridiation, the midday nap, and it was governed by a set of spirits who were so committed to inactivity that they made the other gods look like overachievers. Chief among them was the deity of the heavy lids, the one who ensured that the entire Mediterranean world went silent at exactly 1 p.m. The life of a siesta spirit was a monologue of the click, specifically the click of the wooden shutters being latched against the glare. Their divine purpose was to transform a bright, hot room into a cool, blue-tinted sanctuary. Imagine the patience required to be a god whose primary function is to manage the transition from active to horizontal. It was a career in celestial dimming. They spent their eternity watching the dust motes slow down as the air in the room cooled, a process that moved with the speed of a sundial shadow crossing a single tile. The daily routine of these spirits was the definition of uninterrupted. They didn't want the sound of a cart on the cobblestones, and they didn't want the clouds to move in. They just wanted a steady, unrelenting, and incredibly boring beam of sunlight. They were the gods of the static hang. Their voice was the soft flap-flap of linen in a light breeze, and the smell of hot wool and ozone. It was a language of fibers and ultraviolet rays, a slow, sun-baked lullaby that suggested the day could only truly proceed once everything was perfectly bone dry. There is something profoundly lulling about the world of the laundry. It represents the peace of the held. In this realm, the greatest achievement is a straight hem. When you think of these spirits, you think of a courtyard where the only thing moving is a single grasshopper on a stone wall. They are the spirits of the bleach, the ones who know that the sun can heal almost anything if you just give it enough time. They are the guardians of the unmoving, the ones who understand that there is a deep, quiet power in simply hanging there and letting the universe do the work for you. The spirits of the shutter. Let's drift into the corners of the room where the light tries to leak in and meet the minor spirits of the glimmer. These were the guardians of the cracks in the wood, the ones who ensured that even the tiny slivers of light were soft and unmoving. The sensation, the feeling of cool tile against the skin of a bare foot. The sight, the world outside looking like an overexposed photograph through the slats of the blinds. The sound, the absolute absence of human voices.
The spirits of the siesta represent the reset button of the day. They are the patron saints of the halfway point, the ones who know that the only way to survive the light is to fully embrace the dark. They find fulfillment in the fact that they are providing a temporary death to the ego, allowing the world to breathe without the pressure of being seen. They are the silent, cool-tempered witnesses to the fact that the most important part of the day is the part you aren't conscious for. As we think about the shutters being latched and the spirits of the midday cooling the floors, we can feel a sense of profound, heavy-limbed peace. The street is empty, the shop is closed. The world is a series of slow, dark, indoor breaths. There is no need to be productive. There is no need to answer the door. You are simply a being in a cool room, waiting for the heat to pass over you like a wave. The house is quiet. The shadows are long and blue. The spirits of the afternoon are moving in their slow, horizontal circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, shaded grace.
It's a world that invites you to pull a light sheet over your shoulder, to let your thoughts drift like smoke, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to simply exist in the gap between the morning and the night. Chapter 24. The Creaky Resumption and the Gods of the First Stir. If the siesta was a temporary departure from the world, then the late afternoon was the slow, reluctant return. In the Roman house, this transition wasn't an explosion of energy. It was a gradual reassembly of the self, overseen by a group of spirits who specialized in the first stir. These were the minor deities of the groggy transition, the ones who managed the period between the dream ending and the feet actually hitting the floor. The life of a resumption spirit was a study in the incremental. They didn't deal in grand awakenings. They dealt in the single opening of one eye. Their entire divine existence was a monologue of the creak. Imagine the patience required to be a god whose primary function is to oversee the slow, rhythmic stretching of a stiff lower back. It was a career in celestial lubrication. They spent their eternity watching the circulation return to a sleeping arm, a process that moves with the agonizing slowness of honey sliding down a cold jar, because why not double down on the physics of the pins and needles? The daily routine of these spirits was the definition of low velocity. They didn't want you to rush to the forum. They wanted you to sit on the edge of the couch and stare at a single patch of sunlight for 10 minutes. They were the gods of the blank stare. Their voice was the soft thump of a sandal being found under the bed and the long, slow splash of a second face wash. It was a language of inertia and momentum, a heavy, dust-moted lullaby that suggested the day's second half should be approached with extreme caution. The spirits of the lengthening beam. As the sun begins its descent, we meet the minor spirits of the gold shift. These were the guardians of the afternoon light as it turns from a harsh white to a deep honeyed amber. The sensation, the warmth of the sun on the back of the neck as you finally step back outside. The sight, the dust motes in the atrium performing a slow vertical dance in the orange light. The sound, the first distant sounds of the city waking up, the clink of a merchant's scale, the far-off call of a fruit seller. The spirits of the resumption represent the grace period. They are the patron saints of the second chance, the ones who know that the world is a little bit softer after it's been asleep for 2 hours. They find fulfillment in the fact that they are providing a buffer against the evening's demands. They are the silent, amber-tinted witnesses to the fact that the most dignified way to move through life is at a pace that allows you to count the stones in the wall. As we think about the shutters being opening and the spirits of the afternoon light stretching across the floor, we can feel a sense of profound, rhythmic peace. The nap is over, but the work hasn't quite begun. The world is a series of slow, deliberate yawns. There is no need to run to the baths. There is no need to join the crowd. You are simply a being in the golden hour, waiting for the shadows to grow long enough to touch the opposite wall. The house is breathing again. The air is warm and still. The spirits of the late afternoon are moving in their slow, golden circles, and the world is held in a state of perfect, unhurried grace. It's a world that invites you to pull a light sheet over your shoulder, to let your thoughts drift like smoke, and to realize that the most beautiful thing you can do right now is to simply exist in the gap between the morning and the night.